Well, thank you once again for that kind and, as ever, colourful introduction. It's such a pleasure to be with you all again. It's been a real joy for us at RZIM Asia to partner with the CCF community and the CCF family, our dear friends and brothers and sisters in Christ, to be able to bring you this apologetic series. And so a very special welcome once again to those of you joining for the first time or who might be returning, and especially special welcome to those of you who might not call yourselves Christians or who might be searching for truth or struggling in your faith. We hope this series has been useful and helpful for you, and it's been a pleasure for us to bring it to you along with CCF, and a joy for me to bring you this final talk and to take your questions afterwards. Such an important question, such a common question, both amongst Christians and non-Christians. Why trust the Bible? Why should I trust the Bible? There's a movie from about 20 years ago, and I won't name the movie because it's a terrible movie, but there is one really interesting scene in that movie that is relevant to today's question. And the scene is of these two thieves who have stolen a cash machine from a bank. They've ripped this ATM out of a wall or out of the bank, and they've got it in a wheelbarrow, and they're just walking very calmly down the street. The machine is covered with a sheet, so no one knows what's in there. And these thieves, these criminals, are just walking down a main street in broad daylight with this ATM in the wheelbarrow. And they see a police car turning in at the top of the street. And it's a very busy street. There's people walking, there's shops open. It could be any big city that we know of. And they don't have time, of course, to run away from the policeman. And so what do? They ditch the wheelbarrow, they lift this ATM out of the wheelbarrow and put it up against a wall next to one of the shops on this busy shopping strip. And one of the thieves stands at the ATM, and the second thief stands behind him as if he's waiting to use it. And by the time the police car drives past, the officer looks across at this ATM and sees a line of 6 or 7 people waiting to use the cash machine. Why is it an amusing moment in this movie? Well, of course, it's amusing. The humor is there in a very obvious way because there are all these people just standing in line for a stolen, not plugged in, illegitimate ATM. They've all just decided to come and stand there because they saw someone else standing there, and it happened within, a matter of seconds. And with something like a cash machine, that's pretty amusing. It's not a big deal. If you're waiting in line for a cash machine and you get to the front of the line and you find out that it's not plugged in or it's not real, you've probably just wasted, 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes at worst. So it's actually not that big a thing. But on the bigger, deeper questions of life, on meaning, on morality, questions of faith, questions of purpose, questions of fulfillment and flourishing, questions of suffering, on these big questions that we've been dealing with some of during this series, it actually helps to think carefully and to check whether what we believe is actually plugged in, to check more closely whether what we have come to believe is not just because other people are believing it or disbelieving it. And so this truth applies to all of us no matter what we believe. If you're a Christian who's struggling with their faith, who might have fallen away from God, who might be wrestling with God, you've got questions. Or indeed, if you're an atheist or a skeptic or an agnostic and you're really walking in a life of rejection of God or denial of Him, it doesn't really matter. We're all standing in line for an ATM. The question is the ATM plugged in? We all believe in something. The question is it true? And we hope that through this series we have shown you that if you follow the evidence to where it leads, and the great philosopher Plato said this, all you need to do to find truth is follow the evidence to where it leads. And with the topics and the issues we've been dealing with, we hope that you have seen just a glimpse of some of the questions out there, and when you follow that evidence, it leads you to the person of Jesus Christ. And that's why we've chosen to close this series with this deeply, deeply important question of where so much of God's truth and so much of His message to you and to me, and so much of the history of God's work in the world and God's activity in the world comes together, the Bible. So the question then remains, both for the Christian and the non-Christian, on what basis can we trust this book? On what basis can we trust the Christian Bible? How do we know this is plugged in? How do we know this is not just an ATM that people have been standing in line believing because others have? And similarly, if you're not a Christian, how do you know that rejecting the truth of the Bible is the right thing too? How do you know that that ATM is plugged in? Are you just believing that because other people have told you, or because you've just assumed that it's fiction, or because you haven't really taken the time to look more closely. So I want to give you some things to think about on this really important question of why we should trust the Bible. Now, there are so many reasons why we can trust the Bible, but obviously I'm not going to be able to go into all of them. I want to go into just 4 of these reasons, 4 categories of evidence, if you like, or categories of credibility on which the Christian Bible reveals itself and proves itself to be completely legitimate. And so these are the 4 categories I want to talk to you about. First of all, peer review. Secondly, prophecy. Thirdly, parchments, which basically refers to all of the copies and the manuscripts that we have and the transcripts of the Bible. And fourthly, people, the names in the Bible, and how that has actually emerged as a really powerful area of research and historical scholarship on these big issues. So I want to work through each of these 4 things and just show you some of the evidence out there. If you've been tuning into this series and conceptually you understand what we've been talking about in your mind, in your heart, there's something there that's been kind of chipping away, but the real sticking point for you has been this Bible that these Christians hold so dear. Or if you happen to be a Christian and there are things that you struggle with about the Bible, the main issue that a lot of people have, both Christians and non-Christians, is that some Christians, unfortunately, will give answers to questions that people have, legitimate questions, questions about suffering, questions about sexuality, questions about fulfillment, and the answer will be nothing more than because the Bible says so. That's why we believe it, because the Bible says so. And very sadly, that's ironically a very unbiblical answer. Because first of all, the Bible doesn't say that you just answer questions by saying because the Bible says so. The Bible gives lots and lots of reasoning to back up the questions. The Bible gives a full account of human flourishing. The Christian message gives this wonderful story that God is inviting each of us into. And we hope that we've been able to catalogue some of that story over this series. But the other thing is, the question we really should be asking if you struggle with the Bible itself, or you struggle with people who just say, because the Bible says so, the question is not, well, because they just say that, it's not true. The deeper question is, on what basis can the Bible be believed? Where is the legitimacy and credibility of the Bible itself? And this goes for anything that we're trying to prove. It really goes to the credibility of the source, the credibility of the evidence. So these 4 things are worth looking at: peer review, prophecy, parchments, and people. Firstly, peer review. Now, anyone who is involved in academia in any way, if you've been to university or if you're studying at university now, one of the main ways that modern academic scholarship is catalogued and tested for credibility is the extent to which other academics and other experts cite your work. So this is a system of peer review or peer citation. And so academics are ranked, if you like, or even considered credible and considered influential based largely on the extent to which other academics are using their work, and then the extent to which other credible academics are using the work of those academic citations of the opening source of the citation. So it's really a question of group credibility. The more other experts agree with what you're saying, the more you can cross-reference and cross-check. And the more people agree, the more people who are citing you, the more people who are testing what you're saying, and it cross-references and checks out, then the less likely it is that you're just making it up. The less likely it is that it's just fiction, or that you're a con artist, or that you're a charlatan. So peer review is important in academia. And when we look inside the Bible, first of all, we see something that a lot of people don't understand right out of the bat, and that is that the Bible is not one book. In fact, the word Bible, biblios, means the books, plural. And we know that the Bible is 66 books, written over around 1,500 years by something like 40 plus authors. Right? So around 40 plus authors, 1,500 years, across 3 continents, in at least 3 languages. This Bible was written. So we're dealing with a really important collection of books that come together. Now, the beauty of the fact that it's a collection of books is that we can test it for peer citation within itself. Is the Bible internally coherent and internally credible in the context of peer review? And the short answer is that it is. Studies have been done, a lot of research has been done, and we can find around 63,000 examples of internal, cross-checkable, cross-referenceable peer review within the Bible. 63,000 times at least in which one part of the Bible corresponds directly or refers directly to another part of the Bible. That's incredible. That's a very high concentration of peer review for one set of books to have within it. Now, that in and of itself doesn't necessarily prove that the Bible is true in itself, but it's an important first step. The fact that the Bible all fits together, the fact that these 40 plus people writing across 2 millennia, across 3 continents in multiple languages, the fact that most of them, the vast majority of them, had never met each other or didn't know each other, and it all comports, it all kind of fits together in a coherent whole. And incredibly, it all points to one person. It all points to the person of Jesus Christ, right? So this cross-referenceable, testable aspect of the Christian Bible is often forgotten and easily understated. But it's really important, I think. When you're talking about 63,000 examples of these cross-references, that's a pretty important first step. So peer review. Secondly, prophecy. Now, prophecy, of course, is when we see examples of things that people have said, and the only way they could have known that what they said was going to happen is if there was some aspect of divine revelation, if God was actually involved, if there was some kind of supernatural involvement in this person's ability to actually say something that was going to happen, and then it happened. And now, of course, today we have forecasters and people can guess and we can build predictive models to try and work out what is going to happen. But when we look in the Christian Bible, it becomes very clear there is just an enormous weight of prophecy that is backed up, that is very, very specific, and that is backed up by the fact that it subsequently happens. And here's the thing, it doesn't just subsequently happen as catalogued in the Bible, you can actually check it against non-biblical historical sources, whether it's archaeological sources or anthropological sources, or simply just non-biblical writers, so historians that were writing at the time of these things, who didn't happen to be Christian, didn't happen to be authors or part authors of the Bible itself, people like Josephus and Tacitus and other people who were documenting those events or events around that time. And so the fact that the Bible has all of these prophecies in them, and just on the person of Jesus alone, there are around 350 prophetic statements in the Old Testament that Jesus then fulfills through his birth, life, death, and resurrection in the New Testament. So just on the person of Jesus Christ, there are around 350, and there are plenty of others in relation to other aspects of history. A good example is the book of Daniel. In the book of Daniel, there are prophecies in that book that were written and that are testable and datable to long before these things actually happened. The breaking down of empires, the merging and the rising of new empires, the division of empires. These are big political, geopolitical shifts. And both through evidence inside the Bible, verified by historical evidence outside the Bible, we can cross-check these prophecies. Now, on the life of Jesus, just coming back to that quickly before I move on to my next point, the life of Jesus, I said that there are around 350 Old Testament prophetic statements that are fulfilled in the New Testament. Some of them, admittedly, are things that could be manipulated, either by someone claiming to be Jesus or claiming to be the Messiah, or by someone trying to invent a story in that space. So some of them are about things like his manner, his character, his loving nature, his gentle nature, what he was like. And of course, I could fake that, you could fake that, we could all fake that. But there are some things about Jesus, some of these prophecies that you simply cannot fake. For example, in the book of Micah, one of the Old Testament prophets, it talks about where Jesus is going to be born. Now, it doesn't matter who you are or how good a con artist you are, no one can control where they are born. And yet through historical scholarship, the consensus is very, very clear, not just from Christians, but from non-Christian historians too, that this person, Jesus, was born in Bethlehem at this particular time, in this particular window of time. And it's exactly what was prophesied hundreds and hundreds of years earlier by prophets in the Old Testament scriptures. There's another prophet, a really important one. I mean, they're all important, but this one wrote a lot. His name's Isaiah. And the prophet Isaiah writes a lot about Jesus' death and how he's treated in leading up to his death, the kind of torture and beating and pain and suffering that he has to undergo. Now, it's very difficult to make the claim that, Jesus could orchestrate that. He was at the mercy of the Roman Empire. That's what actually led to his death. And so to have these sorts of prophecies, and there are so many more, and sadly not enough time to go into them in depth, but to have these sorts of prophecies that are very clearly in the Bible, and then to have the fulfillment of those prophecies again and again and again, and to have that fulfillment historically verified both in other parts of the Bible that were written subsequently and dated subsequently, and also, probably even more powerfully, to have those events actually catalogued outside of the Bible by non-Christian historians, that are the events that are widely recognized by the secular or the non-Christian, if you like, historical consensus by historians and experts of ancient history. That's a hugely, hugely powerful thing. So just in these first two categories, we begin to see the beginnings of a cumulative weight of evidence that points directly to the credibility and the legitimacy of the Bible. We've talked about peer review, more than 63,000 cross-referenceable, cross-testable examples in the Bible, and now we've talked about prophecies again and again. People walking with God, claiming to have heard from God, having their stories and their prophecies documented in the Bible that we can date back to pretty accurately when they were actually made, and then having those prophecies backed up by the fact that these events actually took place. Some of them taking place long, long after the prophets were dead and buried, and yet the evidence is there, both inside the Bible and outside of the Bible. So peer review, number one, prophecy, number two. Thirdly, and probably most influentially, at least in an academic and a historical sense, parchments. And I use the word parchments because I'm trying to make all four of them start with P. But with parchments, what we're really talking about is how many copies of this Bible do we have? How many copies do we have? And do they all check out with each other? Now, this is a process, or a test, if you like, that the historians call textual criticism. And this is not a Christian apologetics thing. This is just a very routine, broadly accepted way that historians and ancient historians test the credibility of all documents that make historical claims. Right? So this is not just a test that's applied to the Bible. This is a consensus test that historians apply to everything. And there are two things primarily that this process of textual criticism looks at. It looks at a bunch of other things, and it's obviously a much deeper process. I'm not a historian, and so I know I'm not doing justice to the title textual criticism, but for the purpose of today's message, I just want you to think about these two aspects of textual criticism. And they're pretty rational questions to ask of any historical document that's making claims about things that have happened in history. The first question is this: how many of the early copies do you have? How many of the earliest copies do you have? Because obviously, the more copies you have, the more you can check whether they've been changed over time. You can check how much they fit together or whether they contradict each other, because if they contradict each other, then it's very difficult for any of them to be credible. But if you have more and more and more of these early manuscript copies, and they all check out, they all match each other, then you're on a pretty strong footing on this particular plank of textual criticism. So the more copies, the better. How many copies of the earliest manuscripts have you got? Secondly, how close to the historical events that they are depicting can you date these manuscripts to? Because once again, the closer to the dates of the events they are, the more likely they are to be accurate, the more likely they are to be true. And this makes sense even analogically in a very obvious way. If I asked you all what you had for lunch today, you're much more likely to be able to give me an accurate response than if I said, what did you have for lunch on January 15th? Now, some of you might have amazing memories and remember that, but really, unless January 15th holds some kind of significance for you, a birthday, an anniversary, or something happened on that day that punctuated those memories, it's very unlikely you would remember that. But the closer you are to things, the closer you are to events, the more likely you are to remember them. So these are the two questions of textual criticism, the two main questions of textual criticism. How many copies have you got of the earliest manuscripts, and how early are those manuscripts? And when we look at other historical documents, an incredible pattern begins to emerge. I want to start with the example of Plato. Plato, one of the fathers of philosophy, of modern philosophy anyway, he wrote a lot. He wrote things like the Republic. He wrote lots of seminal philosophical works that are widely accepted by historians, by academics, by philosophers. There isn't really a question of whether or not Plato lived, and there isn't really a question of whether or not Plato wrote what he's deemed to have wrote. That's all very widely accepted. There's no credible scholarship that questions that. In fact, I'm actually not aware of any scholarship, credible or not credible, that questions Plato's existence or his authorship. So let's put Plato's body of work to these two tests. How many copies have we got of the earliest copies? And it's interesting, when it comes to Plato, we've got 7. We've got 7 complete copies of what Plato wrote. And they all check out. They all cross-reference each other. They all correlate with each other. We can test them against each other, and we see that they haven't been doctored. And the earliest of those is dated to around 900 years after Plato wrote them. So 900 years later, that's a fair chunk of time. And yet these 7 copies that we've got, the fact that we've got 7 is sufficient to test. If we just had 2, that would be difficult, because if there were differences, we wouldn't know which was the real one and which was the fake one. But the fact that we have 7 and they all cross-reference means that 900 years, even though it seems like a long time, is okay. And we just accept it. We just accept that Plato wrote what he wrote when he wrote it based on that. So 7 copies, 900 years after Plato wrote them. I want to move on to another ancient Greek writer, Homer. Not Homer Simpson, another Homer. Some of you will be familiar with this Homer. He wrote various things like the Iliad and the Odyssey and lots of other stuff, literature, poetry, and so forth. Now, with Homer, we have far more copies and a far shorter time span between the earliest of those copies and the time at which Homer first wrote them. So while Plato, we only had 7 copies, with Homer, we have 643 copies. 643 copies. And the earliest of those is dated to within 500 years of when he first wrote them. So almost 100 times the number of copies that we have for Plato, and almost half the time in terms of the time between he wrote them and our earliest copies. So once again, that's an incredible number. That's incredibly high in terms of textual criticism, historical legitimacy, and many say, arguably, that in terms of ancient writings outside of the Bible, Homer is one of the most credible and the most verifiable because of just the sheer number of copies that we have. And once again, they all check out, they all cross-reference, and that's why there's no real debate about whether Homer existed, about what he wrote, what he depicted, and about when he wrote them as well. Now, keep all of that in mind, and then we come to the Bible. And just taking the New Testament alone, there are more than 22,000 copies. In the Greek alone, more than 22,000 copies that we have. Copies and fragments and aspects of this New Testament that we can cross-check and cross-reference against each other, and they all check out. And yes, there are small variations. There are small variations in the context of grammar and some words, some synonyms that are changed here and there, but nothing that changes the substance of the message of Jesus Christ. Nothing that changes the orthodox Christian message that we have been speaking to you about throughout this series. Nothing. And we know that because in some Bibles, in fact probably in most of them, there is often a little footnote, and then sometimes you follow that footnote and you'll see the footnote will actually say, in some manuscripts, instead of saying what we have said here, it says this. And so you can look for yourself and actually get an even more full understanding of some of the variations. So the Christian translations of Bibles are pretty reliable and pretty honest, even to those small variations. But the fact that there are so many, literally tens of thousands of these, is incredible. And it's completely unprecedented historically. Completely unprecedented historically. And some of them, and we talk about the timing of the earliest manuscripts to the events that they depict, some of these manuscripts can be dated, to within a few decades of the resurrection of Jesus. Some of them to within 25 to 50 years of his resurrection, and much of the rest to, the 50 or 60 years after that. We're talking about one generation past. We're talking about these biographies of Jesus that actually make reference to people who are still alive and walking around. They've actually been written by people about other people who have witnessed this resurrected Jesus who are still around. That's completely unheard of historically, to the point that one of the former directors of the British Museum, who by all accounts wasn't a Christian, said this very powerful statement, and I'm paraphrasing him, but he said that there isn't really any question about the fact, historically, according to the standards of historical scholarship, that the New Testament of the Christian Bible is the most verifiable document in ancient history. The most verifiable document in ancient history. So that deserves, at the very least, to be taken seriously. It makes sense that we would think through a little more carefully. If this is something that we've just rejected out of hand because we don't like some of the things in it, or because we don't understand some of the things in it, we've been talking a little bit, a couple of our speakers through this series, about what truth actually is and what truth actually means. And it's worth remembering that just because we don't like something or we don't understand something doesn't mean it's not true. I mean, we could reject it for those reasons, but when we are talking about the historical legitimacy of the Bible, it's pretty clear that it's worthy of consideration and that it stands up to the tests of truth. So, just to quickly recap, we've talked about peer review, we've talked about prophecy, we've talked about the parchments, which in my view is probably, the knockout blow. As a former lawyer, if I was taking this thing to court, I'd probably start off with the number of manuscripts and how they cross-reference and check with each other, and how closely they are dated to the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. But I just want to finish with something else a little bit interesting, and this is called name pattern recognition. So this is the fourth P, the fourth category, people. Now, this is something that's been done by a number of scholars recently, beautifully put together by a guy called Richard Borkham in one of his books, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. And name pattern recognition is just another test, like textual criticism, like peer review, like testing of prophecies, both inside and outside the Bible. It's another category of evidence through which we can interrogate the truth value and the legitimacy of this Christian Bible. And name pattern recognition works like this. It basically says, if this is true, if these historical accounts are true, what you would expect is that the things that are depicted in these accounts, whether it's the names of the people or the agriculture or the weather, the climate, whatever it might be, the political situation, the values that you see in this particular document that we want to test and scrutinize, if you look at that, and then you actually look at all of the other evidence we have of that society at that same time, they should match up. And name pattern recognition says, let's do that for names. And so what these scholars have done, and it's fascinating, I'm so glad they've done it, and we owe them a great debt of gratitude for having done this. They went through, using non-biblical sources, what the most common Jewish names were in Palestine around the time of Jesus, right? So what are the average families calling their kids at that time? And thankfully, because of the Roman Empire and because of the record keeping and because of kind of non-biblical historical records we have, whether it's census data or tax records from way back, we can get a fair idea. We can look at the other kinds of historical documents from that time, the literature of that time. And so they put together, for instance, what are the 10 most common baby boy names in Jerusalem or in Palestine amongst Jewish people around the time that Jesus lived and died and rose again? And it said, just on this example of baby boy names, that the most common name, by quite a long way, according to a lot of this research, is the name Simon, Simeon or Simon. So lots and lots of Simons back then. So 6 p.m. downtown Jerusalem, or at the park just across the road from the Jerusalem main street, and all the kids are playing, and a bunch of Jewish mums stick their heads out of the windows of their homes and just yell out, "Simon, it's dinner time," and 1/3 of the kids turn around, or half the kids turn around. So we've all got these names that we know are really common to our generation and to our time. Now, I don't know what it's like for you, wherever you're listening to this or watching this, but growing up in Australia, in the kind of late 1980s, early 1990s, in primary school, the name was Michael. Lots and lots of Michaels. I know there are probably lots of Michaels watching this now, but we had 4 Michaels in one of my classes and 3 Michaels when I was in grade 1, so we had lots of Michaels. Back then, around the time of Jesus, it was Simon. Lots and lots of Simons. Now, what are the less common names? And there are obviously plenty of names that this research showed were not very common at the time. And one example was Philip. Now, doing name pattern recognition to test a historical document, how does that work? Well, you basically have to go through the biographies of Jesus, the Gospels, right, which are claiming to be historical, and say, what are the occurrences like of the different kinds of names? So according to these biographies of Jesus, how frequently do these different names pop up? And does that match with the scholarship and the research that we have of the non-biblical sources? And of course, when you look in the Gospels, it's pretty much identical. It's almost identical down to the decimal point. If there are roughly this many Simons, and the occurrence of Simon is this in non-biblical sources, That's exactly how often we see the word Simon, the name Simon appearing, and how many Simons we see. And the same goes for the least occurring ones and all the way through. The correlation is absolutely incredible. And what tops it off, and what really hits home, I think, is that if you have lots of people called by a name, there would have to be a way of distinguishing between these people, between these Simons. And when you look in the biographies of Jesus, the 4 of them that we have, the testable, verifiable, peer-reviewed biographies of Jesus that we have, that's exactly what you see. You don't just see lots of Simons, but when there are Simons, there's always a specific referent to that Simon. It's never just Simon. It's always Simon of Cyrene, or Simon the Zealot, or Simon the brother of this, or Simon the son of this. It's always Simon something. And that would make perfect sense if there were lots of Simons in that society, which is exactly what the non-biblical evidence shows us. And on the flip side, you would expect the same in reverse for names that are relatively rare. And so when we see Philip in the Bible, when we see Philip in the biographies of Jesus, it's just Philip. Not Philip of anything, or Philip the carpenter, or Philip the son of this, or Philip the brother of this. It's just Philip. It's exactly what you would expect if it was true. Now, I've talked about just 4 categories of evidence, 4 categories of benchmarks, if you like, that the Christian Bible meets and surpasses with flying colours. Right? So we've talked about the importance of peer review. We've talked about the power of prophecy. We've talked about the overwhelming weight of evidence that comes through the parchments and the manuscripts. And we've talked finally just about the people, this name pattern recognition. And there are plenty more to go at if you want to look at the historical legitimacy of this Christian Bible. So my challenge to you and my question to you, no matter where you are with God, if you're walking with Him, if you're struggling with Him, if you're wrestling with Him, if you've got questions, or if you're just in outright rejection of Him right now, my challenge to you is this: take this Bible seriously. It's worthy, at the very least, of investigation. And so if you've got questions about its verifiability, I refer you to everything that I've said so far and so much other literature and scholarship that is out there that we'd love to connect you with, or I'm sure people at CCF would love to connect you with. But more importantly than all of that, I encourage you to just take a book of the Bible and start reading it. And so I really encourage you to just take, if you haven't done before, or you're struggling with this stuff at the moment, the Gospel of John, right? The biography of John. It's a biography of Jesus Christ, and it's written in a powerful and a concise and a compelling way. They all are, but John is just a great place to start. And just read through that. And the reason I say that is because everything I've said, I've been talking about propositional truth. I've been talking about evidence. I've been talking about cross-referencing and carbon dating and manuscript checking and peer review and citations and extra-biblical and intra-biblical evidence and all of these perhaps slightly technical terms that might be confusing, might interest you, might not. But the point is they all refer to the fact that this Christian message, if you look at the evidence and we use the tests of historians, not the tests of pastors, not the tests of theologians, not the tests of Christians, the tests of historians, the experts in the field of ancient history. These all point to the truth, but they don't point to the truth in a propositional way. They point to the truth in a relational way, in a personal way. Because this truth for us Christians is not primarily or exclusively propositional. It's firstly and primarily personal and relational. Because for us, the truth is not a set of proofs or evidences or reasons. The truth is a person. It's the person of Jesus Christ. All of this evidence I've been talking about and everything we've been talking about throughout this series, it does point to the propositional truth of the Christian message, but all of that is underpinned and overwhelmed by the relational and personal truth and experiential power of the Christian message that's made real in the person of Jesus. Every other worldview out there points to truth. It makes truth claims but points to them. It's only the person of Jesus Christ that shows up and says, I am the truth. He points to himself and says, I am the truth. In Christianity, the truth is embodied. It's made real for you in the form of a person so you can relate to it. So we can actually have an up-close and personal relationship with this Jesus, with this embodiment of the truth, to which all of the biblical and non-biblical evidence that we've been talking about throughout this series has been pointing to. And so I encourage you not to miss that. I encourage you that if you've got questions, please ask those questions. If you've got objections, bring them, and they'll be graciously and lovingly dealt with, because this message of Jesus can stand up to questions. I hope we've shown you that throughout this series. It can stand up to your questions, but it's important to remember that we're not trying to get you to agree to a truth. That's not the point of what this series has been about and what Christianity is about. We're not trying to get you to believe in something or to agree to a set of propositions, even though those propositions are true and there is evidence to back those up if that's where you're feeling resistance in your mind and in your heart. The reason we are sharing this with you is because we want to introduce you to a person, the person of Jesus Christ. God made real for you. God made flesh for you so you can relate to him, who died for you, who actually stepped into the world, into human history and died on a cross. That's what this Bible depicts. Those are the historical events. That's the culmination of the Bible I've been talking about. Not just a messy series of historical events over 1500 years, but a very deliberate, however difficult series of events over 1,500 years that culminates with God himself dying on a cross for you as a person, the Son of God, Jesus Christ. And now, what is open to you is not a suggestion for you to believe in something. It's an invitation for you to step into a relationship with someone. So I encourage you today. Today is your day. If you're a Christian or not, make that decision to invite Jesus Christ into your life, or just make that decision to reaffirm your commitment if you're a Christian and you've already done that. To reaffirm and rededicate yourself to walking with this person, Jesus Christ, who came for you, who knows you, who loves you, and whose life, death, and resurrection, as we have recorded in this amazing book that narrates a love story between God and people that ends with an invitation of relationship to you, that's shown in that book, that will touch your head, it'll touch your heart, and it will transform your life. All you have to do is say yes. Thanks again for giving me a hearing. I look forward to your questions.